Okay, I think we're going to start. I want to welcome everybody this morning to our 3 R's, real estate, recreation, and retail. Obviously, the global pandemic has affected all of us in many, many different ways, personally, commercially, economically. What we have here today is we're very fortunate to have 5 of our members from different parts of the world to really talk about the impact, both presently and in the future, caused in the real estate, recreation, and retail industries that are really affecting our daily lives and really will have a global impact on what happens going forward. And each one has a little bit of a different perspective of what's been happening in their country and what their country's been focusing on with respect to these 3 industries. So we're very fortunate today to have Bill Brandt from Development Specialists, Inc., representing the United States, Kwan Kiat, representing from Rajah, Tann, representing Asia, DJ Moller from Thornton, Grout, and Finnigan, representing Canada, Charlotte Moller from Rudnick, representing Europe, and Fabio Rosas from Cescon, representing Latin America. And so we're going to go in alphabetical order. So there's no preference thought about which country we're starting first. And we're going to start with Bill Brandt, who will be speaking from the perspective of the United States. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Robbin. The purpose of this seminar, as we all discussed among ourselves when we were getting ready for it, was to sort of forecast the trends that the pandemic and other issues have brought about, along with accelerating other trends in the industries in our respective countries. And each of us was asked to try and find a topic that is sort of germane to the current geographic location we find ourselves, me for the US, for Singapore, on and on. And so I focused primarily on 2 US trends in my 10 minutes, which I think are going to be unique to responsive to the pandemic and will, if you will, hold out or portend future work for all of us in the insolvency area. The first one I want to mention is, it's really about real estate, but it's more about universities. The larger universities in the United States have, as an average, somewhere between 20 to 23% students. Foreign students, on average, pay basically almost triple what US in-state students pay, or about 50% more than out-of-state students pay. So universities rely heavily on foreign students for their enrollment. There is discussions, of course, among people who are nativists that slow down the enrollment of foreign students and use those slots for domestic students. But what the math behind universities shows is, for every student that is able to be entered at the full price of $22,000 per year for tuition, that actually involves adding money to universities' budgets such that they can enlarge their enrollment and actually pick up additional domestic students. So it's all about growth. So the point of my discussion here is to say, with more than 1 million for the United States last year, and right now less than 20% of that number and declining, both because of the pandemic, but also, unfortunately, because of our current president's immigration statistics, I foresee, and have been talking to a number of folks in higher education, that significant amounts of real estate related to education, think the housing areas nearby, the student housing, both public and private student housing, all of the retail, in fact, the land area for the campuses themselves and some universities will find themselves in trouble in the near future. There are beginning to be discussions that I've had now with 2 universities, these are private universities, small, about going out of business, simply not sustain themselves with respect to the lack of foreign students and on a domestic audience as well. The foreign student population tends to pick the United States over other English-speaking countries about 3 to 1. But what has happened is England and Wales, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have also bounced back quicker with the acceptance of foreign students, and they are still coming. The US immigration has slowed that down. So for one area I want to focus on very quickly, I think we are all in the United States a significant amount of restructuring of higher education, simply because the underlying budgets aren't there to forecast, if you will, continued growth, because if you will, in November here in the United States. But as far as we can tell, the inbred trends for the lack of foreign students is something that's now probably going to take 4 or 5 years to recorrect. Foreign students now are diminishing their choice of the United States. Last week, I ran into there is a 45% drop in interest on the part of foreign students to come to the U.S., precisely because of the immigration hassles, but as well as because of the pandemic. And I think we're going to see a significant amount of insolvencies related to those areas. The solution, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously there is a need for public housing. There is a need for homelessness, and you can convert a lot of these things if you're handling these in a restructuring. But as I look at it, I think that unique to America, we are going to get retrenchment in our higher education programs simply because we are excluding a significant amount of our population, about 1/5 to 1/4, who pays the highest tuition. Secondarily, I'd like to look at a bit of retail. Now, everybody on this call is going to tell you retail is a problem, but the United States is what we would call in the retail business measurably overstored. There is approximately 23.5 States of America. Now, 23.5 like much. The average
Bill, excuse me, you're freezing. Can you start over with that percentage, because you got cut out?
I'm sorry. 23.5%, 23.5 square feet of retail for every American citizen. That doesn't seem like a lot when some people about it. But the average in the EU is 4 square feet per person. In Italy, it's under 0.6. In China, it's 3.8. 8 to 9 times square footage wise and size wise than most retail markets. Retail has been falling for a long time. If you look at the analysis of retail, you see that the largest number of store closings we had prior to this last couple of years was in 2008, 2007, in the last recession. But the full-on Amazon effect, if I can phrase it that way, began in 2017, again, when we approximated what we lost in retail store numbers as to compared to the big recession. We lost about 2017, up to 9,000 units of retail in 2019. This year, we're going to lose more than 27,000 stores. So 3 times what we lost last year. The issue is whether it will come back or not. I happen not to think so, but again, if you're doing what are the trends when you look at the larger pictures? Well, Amazon, the pandemic has taught us all how to eat at home. And one of the issues at home in America is there is insufficient cold storage for product to stores and to homes. Most of the United States cold storage warehouses, and we have about 214 million square feet of cold storage, are in exurban parts of the country, near centers for food stores and the like, and 5 years old. There is a huge need now, and there is a push among industrial folks to locate cold storage warehouses in dense parts of the inner city. Amazon is going to probably convert a lot of B and C malls, which are we've been talking about having the biggest problem. America not only is overstored, but overmalled. Class A malls, department stores, and the best retailers will probably fare okay during the Class B malls and Class C malls, which are the older ones, are not going to fare so well. They're being converted, believe it or not, at a reasonable rate to fulfillment centers for Amazon and for others who can use the raw warehouse space they create. They do not lend themselves to cold storage, however, and now the need for home delivery of groceries is such that in a number of inner city areas, redevelopment is actually occurring in dense with cold storage locales. So when you're doing insolvency for B and C malls, give some thought to the fact that what is needed now is massive distribution centers and warehouse. And in some smaller malls areas close to the inner cities and close to other areas, redevelop it into cold storage for fast delivery of groceries, replenishment of everything from frozen food to milk in food stores, not toilet paper, fortunately, that comes from other warehouses, but milk and frozen foods, as well as to home deliveries, is what's needed. So there's a massive shakeup in retail, but it's going into warehousing and cold storage. The space will be used just in other locales and for other uses. And similarly, the other issue we have, as I say, is with universities. So for those of us in the insolvency arena in the US, we're going to see a lot of housing stock and a lot of raw land and buildings connected, a lot of empty storefronts and empty malls. They are not going to be torn down largely. They're going to be repurposed. And the trick in insolvency will see if you can imaginatively come up with something to repurchase them. So that is the current two trends I want to focus on in the US. There's a lot of other trends. We are an extractive economy in the West, much like Saudi Arabia. And with the decline in oil prices, the West is going to feel some problems. But largely our urban areas and our cities where the retail is located and where the universities are going to present the most near-term problems because of the dramatic changes in both foreign students and in how home deliveries are getting it. And I've got some window washers coming. With that, I will end my United States update and throw it back to Robbin.
Thank you, Bill. Fascinating.
I paid those guys to show up at the end to tell me when I was done.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. And we did have a little trouble reading, unfortunately, every few words. So I think we got, fortunately, when it froze, it kind of froze what you were saying. So when you said it, we could hear. But if any, we're going to have questions at the end. For everyone, I want to remind everyone, you have your Q&A button at the bottom. We're not doing chat, but we're doing Q&A button. So if you have questions, please write them down. And at the end, we'll have your questions asked. And if there's anything you missed from Bill, let us know and he'll make sure.
Sorry about my connection.
The windows are being cleaned very well behind you.
Only went bad once we started.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we're going to turn it now over to Kwan Kiat from Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbin. So I'm going to touch on the three areas, the three R's: recreation, retail, real estate. So I'll just touch on recreation and retail first. Now, the pandemic in Asia, as in many parts of the world, has had an overall chilling effect on recreation and retail in general. Different countries in Asia have different degrees of severity and magnitude of the pandemic. In countries like Hong Kong and South Korea, you see a second or third waves of infections. But thankfully, I think in many places, the situation seems largely under control. In general, many businesses in retail and recreation are in trouble. They are in need of protection and debt restructuring because simply it's a health issue. People are just afraid to go out. People are afraid to be in crowds, at least in the beginning. And we have seen many mid-sized businesses in retail and recreation going under, either being wound up or going into administration. We see comparatively less failures or distress among the real estate players. I think many of them are affected in some ways, but many real estate players, they have the resources to carry on in the foreseeable future, it seems. What is very unique, I think, in Asia is that we see a lot of specific targeted legislation passed by governments very often in very quick time to try to help businesses. So you see COVID-specific, COVID-related legislation. In Singapore, for example, you have COVID Acts and a whole of regulations. Much of that is targeted at helping small and medium-sized companies in recreation and retail and other industries as well. Examples of such help include increasing the monetary thresholds and timelines for winding up of bankruptcy applications. So for example, in Singapore, what was pre-COVID was that the timeline for complying with a statutory demand for presumption, for raising presumption of insolvency used to be 3 weeks. It's been increased to 6 months. So just to give a bit more breathing space for small and medium-sized enterprises. And across Asia, in addition to legislation, we do see significant and extensive government measures aimed at helping to alleviate the difficulties faced by companies in the 3R sectors as well. And you see, for example, rental relief rebates for tenants. So you have malls with tenants and there's just no business, no footfall, no human traffic. And there are a lot of measures to give rental rebates to pass on to the shop owners. Most big companies thus far have been able so far to withstand the shock and pressure caused by the pandemic. And there are two aspects I want to talk about in Asia in particular. There are many large corporations in the 3Rs, in recreation, retail, and real estate, which are sufficiently diversified. So for example, you have many large retailers who are also property owners and who may also have important businesses in technology or in healthcare. In other words, the counterbalancing sectors which are benefiting from the pandemic. And also the second point is that in Asia, it does seem that shopping malls serve a larger function than just retail. Many people do enjoy going to malls, shopping malls, just as a form of leisure, right? So once the movement control measures are eased, we see crowds coming back again to shopping malls and various malls across Asia, of course, with masks and with the necessary measures put in place. Now, nonetheless, having said that, there are some notable restructuring cases related to the 3Rs industries. In the gaming industry, for example, we have an important player in Asia called Genting in Hong Kong. Genting is an operator of leisure cruises and casinos and operators. They are undergoing a restructuring process out of Hong Kong primarily. And linked to recreation, we have the airlines industry as well. Thai Airways, a very popular airline, is under a debt rehabilitation process in Thailand and seeking Chapter 15 recognition, and has sought recognition in Australia and in Singapore as well. So as a future trend, we do see a huge push towards technology. And there's a huge push in having activities, recreation and retail going online. So there's been a surge in online retail, a surge in online recreation activities. It's not a complete substitute. I think nothing can replace going out to a mall and going on holiday, for example. But what we have seen is that the pandemic has led to a germination and growth in innovation, in technology in general. So that is what I've given as a snapshot of the situation in Asia, and happy to discuss questions later. Over to you, Robbin.
Fabulous, thank you, Kwan Kit. Very, very interesting. It's really fascinating to get these different perspectives from the different countries. Again, reminding everybody, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please go to your Q&A button at the bottom or the side, depending on your screen, and put in your question. All right, we're going to turn it over now to DJ Miller of Toronto.
Good morning, all. And yes, I'll give a snapshot of what's going on in Canada with respect to the 3Rs. Starting with retail, it has been sort of our version of retail Armageddon in Canada. Retail has been struggling for some time. This year has been particularly bad, not surprisingly, with COVID. Some long-standing iconic brands in Canada have done formal restructurings. Reitman's, Moore's, the men's store, David's Tea, and a number of others. And for a lot of these, it will mean closures, permanent closures, not just shedding leases and locations and restructuring. For some of them, a lot of retailers have not yet commenced formal restructuring proceedings, but they are in a wait-and-see mode. And that's created a certain climate with retail generally in Canada and the tension between landlords and tenants. One of the somewhat unique issues, I guess, in Canada in dealing with retail, which brings into play the broader discussion of commercial tenancies and landlord rights, is that in Canada, all of our main insolvency legislation is federal, so it applies equally in all provinces and territories. The difficulty, though, is that certain rights, one of which is commercial tenancy rights, are provincial. And so while federal insolvency law governs what happens in a formal filing, and it governs the rights and the priority of, for example, landlords in a formal insolvency restructuring proceeding, outside of a proceeding, which is really what's happening in Canada right now for many of these retailers, it's like a patchwork quilt, because depending on what province you're in and what the provincial legislation says in terms of the rights that that landlords can take, coupled with varying degrees of provincial legislation and measures that have been put in place to deal with small businesses and economic relief for certain businesses. So it really has created this patchwork quilt of uncertainty, depending on what the size of the retailer is, depending on what province certain of its retail locations may be in, and depending on whether it's outside of a proceeding or not. Just by way of example, for a landlord to a large retail tenant in Canada who has locations in all of the provinces across Canada, during this COVID period, that landlord, if it was looking at its leases in Ontario, it would have the right to issue notices of default, issue demands for payment, and issue statements of claim for unpaid rent or for relief. It wasn't entitled to require the delivery of a statement of defense because there was a certain suspension of time periods, but it could certainly take all of those steps. In the province of Alberta, for example, that same landlord and that same retail tenant with respect to its locations in Alberta was not even permitted to issue a notice of default. So you can have the same landlord, the same national retail tenant, where you have completely different rights and ability to exercise those rights depending on the province. The result is that you've got, on the one hand, insolvent tenants who are trying to deal with landlords taking disparate types of steps and looking for different types of relief based on the province that they're located in, and a retail tenant who's trying to manage the situation on a broader spectrum. And obviously the flip side is also the same for the landlord. Another unique aspect in the retail side in Canada is that our main insolvency statute requires and has as a clear provision in the Act that once a formal insolvency proceeding is filed, no one is required to supply goods or services to a debtor company on credit. So that means that people are required to either pay COD or to make arrangements up front. That provision has always been relied on in retail proceedings to mean that payment of rent is not negotiable. It must be paid. The most that the courts will do to date is to say, if your rent is due monthly, we will allow it to be paid every 2 weeks instead of once a month, but the rent must be paid. And so it's created this bizarre situation in Canada in some respects, where there are a number of retailers who for quite some time, and I think still, quite frankly, cannot afford to restructure, because right now they may be in a situation where they're not paying rent and they're engaged in this sort of game of chicken with their landlord to see whether the landlord will take steps to terminate or to evict, versus how long they're going to be able to drag this out or try and negotiate for some solution in an out-of-court setting. During the time, for example, when malls were closed in Canada, retail tenants couldn't afford to file because they couldn't use the premises, and so they would have to pay rent from the time they filed. They couldn't even conduct liquidation sales because they couldn't even have a liquidator on site to sell. So it creates this strange dynamic of negotiations that has the entire sector in Canada on a very, very uneasy and uncertain platform. We then have overlaid our one province, Quebec, which has is the civil code. It's not a common law jurisdiction. It's sort of Canada's equivalent of Louisiana. And so it is, that brings with it a whole other layer of issues, because if a large retailer has stores across Canada, they are going to have stores in Quebec. So that has brought with it a bunch of unique challenges as well. So just touching briefly on real estate, the the biggest issue in Canada is that property values have increased significantly. So we are seeing so many development companies who had pre-sales, in some cases massive, massive numbers of pre-sales of residential units in condominiums. And they're filing for protection and they're terminating all of those pre-sale agreements because they can now obtain 20% more for those units than they did. So it's created sort of opportunistic filings in a lot of respects in Canada in that real estate market. Just very briefly on the recreation side, we have one very high profile filing, which is the Cirque du Soleil that filed. It completely had to shut down almost overnight when COVID hit. It's been subject to a credit bid recently, and that is an iconic Canadian industry with 5,000 acrobats and technicians that were out of work literally overnight. The interesting thing, and I'm just going to slip this in under recreation, I don't know if it fits or not, but cannabis is legal in Canada. And so that kind of begs the question of what's happened during COVID. With all of the chaos in Canada that was going on in retail and everywhere else, the government decided that cannabis was an essential service. So that's just the kind of country that we live in, where schools are closed, malls are closed, we have complete economic disaster. But thankfully, our liquor stores, which are also government controlled and run, and our legal cannabis are essential. So we clearly have our priorities straight. There have been a number of M&A deals that have been terminated and that are subject to litigation as a result of COVID. One of the biggest ones is Cineplex, a large theater company in Canada. And the last point that I'll just make under recreation is that our airline industry is decimated right now. Unlike some other countries, Canadian airlines have not received industry-specific support from the government. There have been, broad support available for different size businesses, but not specifically for the airline industry. And so, for example, Air Canada, which is our largest airline, is currently flying at 5% of its capacity. And that's the same across the board for all of the airlines. And so its stock has lost about 63% of the value just in this period. That's, at one point, the reports were saying that it was burning $20 million a day. So these are, big numbers, and it's hard to imagine what that industry is going to look like when all is said and done. But there's going to be repercussions and fallout in Canada in all of these industries for years and years and years to come. I think I've taken up my time.
Thank you, DJ. Well, now we know why the Canadians are smiling throughout the pandemic.
Happy Canadians.
Right. I think you're gonna get an influx of new people moving in now. So thank you. We turn next to Charlotte Moller from England and Wales.
Hello.
Charlotte?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you today. I'm not sure how I follow that, DJ. It's probably the one thing that the UK government hasn't tried so far is the cannabis route. So, I guess in common with what you've been hearing from the other regions today, there's been a lot of focus on our 3 Rs in Europe, both in stress and de-stress. However, in actual fact, in Europe, the insolvency filings as a whole are actually lower than they have been for a long period of time. And we'll come back to why that is. But in the context of what else I'm going to say, it is probably quite important to remember that, because now I'm going to run through all the exceptions to that rule, I suppose. And really what we've seen is a couple of major trends. So one is the acceleration of what was already happening. So, for example, the move into online shopping and move away from the high street as we know it, move away from the malls. It sounds very similar to what Bill was describing earlier. And probably in some parts of Europe, it is even more marked than it is in the UK because they haven't had the same kind of online shopping market previously. So there's definitely been an acceleration of the existing trends. But then in the short term, what we've also seen in Europe is the impact of business being effectively bailed out on a quite mind-boggling scale by government in terms of both legislative change and also financially. And while in somewhere like the UK, we have seen a tension perhaps between the various parts of the UK on a much smaller geographic scale than in Canada, for example, what we have seen across the board is a massive take-up of the government's employee furlough scheme, which essentially underwrote the cost up to 80% for employers of sending your employees home, but paying them 80% of their wages in any event. And that scheme is still ongoing. It runs until the end of October here. And what we've seen is that in the kind of sectors that we are focusing on, there has been a huge uptake of that. So in terms of rates of the take-up of the furlough scheme, for the accommodation and food sectors, there's been a 77% take-up of the scheme. And in terms of just the largest number of employees who've been furloughed, retail is right up there, with 1.9 million people having been furloughed. So if you imagine 1.9 million people in retail alone are effectively being paid by the state, at least up to the end of August, which is where these figures run to. And the scheme as a whole, up to the end of August, has cost 37.5 billion sterling. And now it is being slowly pared back. But it gives you a sense of the scale of the economic intervention that we've been seeing in the UK and across Europe more generally, because there have also been a huge swathe of government-sponsored loan schemes. Sometimes it's government guarantees that sit behind other bank structures, and sometimes it is effectively direct lending from the government into various companies. And so actually, in that context, it's perhaps not surprising that there's been a drop-off of insolvency filings for the time being. And then together with that, there's also been legislative change in the UK. So in what must have been absolute record time for UK legislation, we saw here the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, which was passed. Certain aspects of it have been discussed for the last 5 years and had effectively been sort of sidelined for Brexit for a very long time, and none of us expected it to see the light of day. And then suddenly, within the process of literally a couple of months, we've got a rescue moratorium, we've got ipso facto restrictions on termination of contracts in insolvency, and we've got our so-called super scheme, which allows for the court to mandate cram-downs of creditor or sponsor classes where interested groups don't vote for the scheme, but the court takes the view that actually it is in the greater interest that it should be voted through. So something like Virgin Airways has already used the super scheme. In fact, there was no cram-down mandated by the court on that one. Excuse me. Because actually all the classes agreed in the end. Excuse me 1 second. I promise it's nothing catching. But nevertheless, the scheme is there and we're beginning to use it. And my French colleagues tell me that the picture is not dissimilar in France at all, where formal insolvency filings are also down. And there's been, just in the restaurant and hotel sector, there's been 8 billion euros of state guaranteed loans put into the economy. And I guess, in the travel industry, you can look to Germany and you see even just a travel group like TUI, which is a large travel group, huge amount of consumers. and an airline as well, and they've received a stabilisation package just for one company, or for one group at least, of 1.2 billion euros. So again, mind-boggling numbers, in fact. And so in terms of the existing trends that we're seeing, there's been an incredible acceleration onto the online marketplace for retail. And that has sort of led to a slew of retail company voluntary arrangements, and something very similar also in the casual dining sector, in fact. And also pre-pack administrations where people haven't had time to get the company voluntary administration or arrangements through. And in the retail space, this has included actually some quite innovative structures, such as the CVA to compromise US landlords' leases on All Saints, and then a large number of pre-packs in of high street brand names, which have actually vanished off the high street altogether and have now only got an online presence. So reasonably well-known ones, I suspect, globally are Kath Kitson, Laura Ashley, and TM Lewin, which have all ended up going down that route. And even where some physical stores remain, there is a huge push to place more risk on the commercial landlords. So we've seen some large landlord name filings. There was Into, which was in some difficulty prior to COVID, but again, this has accelerated everything, and the holding companies there have filed for administration. But there has also been, with the legislation that was brought through, effectively a prohibition until the end of September, and we're all waiting with bated breath to see if it gets extended, on forfeiture of leases, or indeed of bringing winding up petitions against tenants unless you can prove that that winding up petition is not COVID related in any way. And that means that actually there's been a long period of time when people have been able to sit back, plan their CVA. Those are coming through now. But there is also a sort of bottleneck of unpaid rent, which has to be dealt with somehow, and some boards of directors around the place who are probably having some very difficult conversations about how to deal with that situation. And landlords are finding that the retailers are placing more risk on them because they're effectively turning to turnover-based rents, which will be payable monthly rather than quarterly, and very much based on how well the retailer themselves are doing. So we saw New Look was got through its CVA voting yesterday, and that's very much a CVA very heavily based on turnover rents. So as a landlord, I suppose you would be taking a step back when you get a new tenant through the door and making sure that you really are comfortable that their business model is one that you think will succeed long term. And so we've also seen a similar story in the hospitality sector, although perhaps less immediately pronounced. So on the hotel side, we've seen a few CVAs with Travelodge, for example, but also a lot of analysis from potential investors as to whether and when the right time to invest in those kind of assets would be. And with a bit of guidance from the government, should we say, there's been a general trend from banks to waive covenant breaches for 6 to 9 months during this period of time, and then with a view to reviewing the situation at the end of this. But I guess it's becoming increasingly clear that there won't be a resolution within that period. And so we are going to be seeing some more complex fixes and deeper restructurings on the horizon in the hotel sector as well. And I will finish now because I can see I'm running out of time. But just on the airline side before I go, what has been quite interesting to see is how the experience of a lot of aircraft lessors is beginning to echo the experience that the landlords are seeing in terms of the way that the lease payments are made and how they get compromised through the system as well. So I'll hand back to you, Robbin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Very interesting. Some of those numbers are just staggering, amazing. Okay, well, our last speaker, but certainly not least, is Fabio Rosas from Brazil. Fabio?
Thanks, Robbin. Well, speaking about Latin America, we had, let's say, the same impacts and almost the same impacts, and with certain specifics on local economies here down in South America and Central America as well. I believe the first reaction, I will say first about the legislation and regulation that were enacted during this period of time since March this year, late March. But one characteristics that we had was that we had a late crisis, late compared with the, let's say, most part of the world, because maybe we were later on having the crisis, the peak of the crisis, and where some countries are still living the certain a kind of a high numbers of casualties, etc. So, and new cases, etc. So we were trying to learn with other jurisdictions and other part of the world, especially what happened in Europe and how Europe dealt with the economic crisis, and how also US, but I believe US was more like similar in terms of timing, a little bit ahead of us, but such like Brazil, for example, experience in Brazil. But the government, I believe the first reaction that the government had and the governments through the region was starting a kind of executive or a presidential decrees and government itself regulation, trying to grant relief to companies, for the companies, and also to put more money on people's hands. And they had differently from what Charlotte said in UK, for example, we had direct money given to the people, like for months. So as a minimum wage or a minimum salary, but you don't need even to be an unemployed person to receive the financial aid from the government. It was a kind of a 600 reais per month, which in Brazil means a lot for a lot of people. We had an estimation of around 60 million people receiving past 4 or 5 months, in fact, every month this amount, which is big in terms of Brazilian numbers. Brazilian people receiving and being the beneficiary of those measures, and especially it sustained, and that's one of the reasons it sustained people, sustaining a part of the economy, and especially the sectors that we are dealing here and we are exploring here, the retail, especially the retail, not the physical retail, but certainly the e-commerce, the online business retail, and certain part of the companies, even the companies that were also benefited with the legislation, or in fact not a law but a government enactment of decrees, etc., that relieve the charges, labor charges, and also suspending or reducing salaries, allowing the companies to suspend or reduce salaries. So, but the regional governments also try to enact and propose new laws and new bills of laws specifically related to insolvency. And but we are still waiting for, let's say, the final approval on Senates, especially in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico. They were kind of developed. We had, for example, approvals on the House of Representatives, but we do not have, they are still pending Senate approvals. And most probably soon we will have, let's say, a wave of reforms on legislation and insolvency or preventive in certain countries, we have preventive measures established under the law. We do not have, let's say, by now, we do not have any legislation or regulation related to that, but soon we may have it. So considering the specific markets that we are, that's the environment in which retail, real estate, and also recreation. Brazil, for example, is a very important place for tourism, and recreation in terms of tourism was highly affected. Very serious problems they have also with airlines, etc. So, but at first, if we may think about what was the first wave, I believe it was the real estate, as DJ said, also in Canada. Instead of having a kind of a general treatment or a general, let's say, regulation to suspend agreements or to postpone, we had individual or bilateral negotiations, and it was broadly used by April, June this year, and it was the landlords here they understood the situation, and they were very flexible in postponing and suspending agreements in certain situations, and we had several models of renegotiation that we had, but let's say it prevented a wave or a bigger wave of insolvencies and or even restructurings or more formal insolvency proceedings in real estate area. The sales, one interesting thing was that sales of real estate properties in Brazil, they developed this period, and it was surprising. But the reason why was that the interest rates that, for example, in Brazil were always very high, historically high, now are very low. So we are living, I believe, the lower or the lowest interest rates ever, I believe, or at least past 50 years when the numbers started to be researched, etc. So it gave impulse for real estate properties, residential property sales, etc. And they had it in stock. The construction companies here had it in stock. So real estate market was affected. Malls were affected as well as in Asia, Brazilians and most of the people on the region in Mexico, etc. They go to the shopping malls not only to buy clothes, but also to have recreation, to have cinema areas, recreation areas, kids areas, etc., which is a very, let's say, important part of the shopping malls here. So they were affected in the sense, but again, everything is a kind of a suspended by now, and we are waiting for a next wave of more formal insolvencies and more formal even first and trying to solve the problem reorganizations and judicial reorganizations. Certainly people are estimating here that we might have the double of the reorganizations than we had last year, which is considering half of the year, let's say 6 months in the year, it will give an idea on how we will face the problem. But certainly the main area that was affected was the retail and retail stores in Brazil. We had the chains here that are focus on mid-class or even low-class sales to form as their needs on furniture, electronics, etc. So they were very highly impacted. Certain chains here in Brazil specifically were not investing on e-commerce or took much attention the online business. Few of them were already developed and they went well on this period, but we have examples, and now from August on, we have examples of big chains like 300 stores, chains in Peru, Brazil, filing for reorganization because they lack more than 90% of their revenues in 2 or 3 months. So they were highly affected in terms of physical stores and physical business, let's say. What was interesting was that the chains, the retail stores, chains that already invested in online business, they were surviving. They even in a certain, after the first period of a shock when everybody was locked down at home, but after this 1 or 2 months, first 1 or 2 months, they started growing, and they grow like 20 or 30% already this year on online business. So there would be a balance between certainly the brick and mortar business, traditional business, and they were completely affected, and the other ones that other companies in Brazil that already invested on online business. Everybody's going massively in retail business, is going massively to the online business. We had even examples in Brazil that certain online stores that were already developed by bookstores or booksellers. In fact, we still had booksellers, but they were migrating to an online business past 2 or 3 years, but they could not survive this period. So they are selling through judicial reorganizations their online business, and big chains of electronics and big chains of retail stores selling electronics, furniture, etc., are buying the bookstore sellers' online business to have the platform and to have them, surviving on this period. So it was interesting, and it was also, let's say, a very useful tool. The judicial reorganization, the insolvency formal proceeding, on those 2 examples in Brazil, they were the most important online booksellers' online business in Brazil. They were very important examples that judicial reorganizations may also be used for distressed M&As. And just to end up our talks here, I believe, well, airline business, I have to say a word about airline business, because they were, even before the pandemic, they've been already having, let's say, less development in Latin America, but we had examples on Avianca, for example, which filed even before the peak of the pandemic, the Colombian airline, but through Latin American operations, they filed a Chapter 11, not a Chapter 15 in New York. And also we had more recently in June, July, we had Latam Airlines, which is a very big and important and traditional airline in Brazil and also in Latin America, a very strong operation through Latin America. They are a kind of a joint, let's say, ownership between, nowadays between Brazil and Colombia, etc. But they filed straight a Chapter 11 in New York. So trying to get the benefits of a Chapter 11 and considering a real international business there, trying to raise a deep financing, more money to survive, etc. So I believe that's an overview. We have lots of talk about this phase and this pandemic, but we are open to the question and specific interesting things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all our panelists. And as I think is always the case in our industry, financial distress breeds opportunity. So what may be a financial problem in one area becomes an opportunity for another. So I want to thank everybody. It was very interesting. I'm looking to see if we have any questions, and I don't see any. Sherry, I don't know if you're on and I'm missing something, but I don't see any questions. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask of the speakers? I know we're about right on time, so people may need to get back to their offices, but I'm looking, And I don't see anything because you all were so good. Nobody has any questions. Let's see. I don't see any questions. So I think we'll say thank you. And it really was very interesting. I found it very interesting, both in our rehearsal and clearly today, to learn about really what's going on in the different countries. So I want to really thank all our panelists, and we may have to do this again a little later on and see what's changed since what you spoke about today. So thank you, everybody. Everyone be safe. Have a good day, and we'll talk to everybody soon and hopefully see your faces soon. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.